Richard Auclair signed the divorce papers with a smirk, convinced he was discarding a broken woman who would fade into obscurity without his money or his name. He believed Isabella was merely a passenger in his life, easily replaced and forgotten. But Richard forgot the most dangerous rule of power. Never underestimate the person who built your throne. Tonight, Isabella isn't just returning to the world that rejected her. She is arriving in a vintage Rolls-Royce to prove that she wasn't the passenger. She was the engine. The pen scratched against the heavy, cream-colored bond paper, a sound that seemed deafening in the silence of the conference room. It was a Mont Blanc, Richard's favorite, of course. He never missed an opportunity to flaunt a symbol of status, even when dismantling a 15-year marriage. Isabella Sterling sat on the opposite side of the mahogany table, her back as straight as a steel rod. She wasn't crying. That was what irritated Richard the most. He had expected tears. He had expected hysterics, pleading, perhaps a dramatic faint. He had prepared his attorney, Arthur Blackwood, for a scene. He had even practiced his pitying look in the mirror that morning, the look that said, "It's not you, darling. It's just that I've outgrown you." But Isabella just sat there. She was wearing a navy dress he had bought her 3 years ago, one he had always criticized for being too modest. Today, it looked like armor. "Sign here, and initial the bottom of page 42, Blackwood droned, his voice devoid of empathy. He was a shark in a 3-piece suit, charging $600 an hour to dismantle Isabella's life. Isabella picked up the pen. Her hand didn't shake. "Are you sure you understand the terms, Isabella?" Richard asked, leaning back in his leather chair. He swirled the ice in his crystal tumbler of scotch. It was 11 a.m. on a Tuesday. "Once you sign this, the penthouse on Park Avenue is gone. The Hamptons estate is gone. The monthly allowance, gone. You're walking away with the settlement we agreed upon, which, frankly, won't sustain the lifestyle you're accustomed to for very long." He paused, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "I'm just worried about you, Bella. The real world is cold." Isabella looked up, her green eyes piercing through his facade. For the first time in years, Richard felt a flicker of unease. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like someone waking up from a long, suffocating coma. "The cold is preferable to the suffocation of your warmth, Richard," she said softly. Her voice was rusty, unused. She signed the paper. Isabella Sterling. She dropped the name Auclair right there on the table, discarding it like a soiled napkin. Richard scoffed, draining his drink. So dramatic. Camille is waiting downstairs. She wanted to come up, offer her condolences, but I told her it wouldn't be appropriate. The mention of the name was a calculated dagger. Camille de Rocher. 24 years old, a former intern at Auclair Holdings, and the woman currently wearing diamonds that Isabella had helped Richard pick out for their 10th anniversary. "Tell Camille," Isabella said, standing up and smoothing her skirt, "that the position of Mrs. Auclair comes with a lot of hidden duties. I hope she has the stamina for them." She turned to leave. "You're making a mistake, Bella," Richard called after her, his ego bruised by her lack of devastation. "You're 42 years old. You have no career. You have no connections that aren't mine. You'll be managing a bookstore in Brooklyn within a month." Isabella paused at the frosted glass doors. She didn't look back. "Goodbye, Richard." The elevator ride down from the 55th floor of the Rockefeller Center felt like a descent into hell. But when the doors opened to the lobby, Isabella gasped. It wasn't despair. It was oxygen. Outside it was pouring rain, a classic New York deluge. She walked out of the revolving doors. There was Richard's limo parked at the curb. The window rolled down, and she saw Camille's face, beautiful, young, and smug. Camille offered a tiny, pitying wave. Richard emerged from the building behind Isabella, snapping his fingers at his driver. "To Tiffany's, James. Camille needs a pick-me-up." Isabella stood on the sidewalk, the rain instantly soaking her navy dress. She had no umbrella. She had no car waiting. She watched as her husband of 15 years got into the car with his mistress, the heavy door thudding shut with a sound of finality. The limo peeled away, splashing dirty puddle water onto Isabella's heels. She stood there for a long minute, shivering. A doorman from the building, a man she had nodded to for years named Henry, stepped out with a large umbrella. "Mrs. Auclair?" Ma'am," Henry asked gently, holding the canopy over her. "Shall I hail a cab?" Isabella looked at him. Tears finally welled in her eyes, mixing with the rain, not tears of loss, but the terrifying tears of a restart. "No, Henry," she whispered. "I think I'll walk to the subway. I need to learn how to do this again." She turned and walked into the grey storm. Richard thought he had ruined her. He thought he had stripped her of her value. But as she walked toward the 47th Street station, clutching her purse, which contained a check for a modest settlement and her freedom, Isabella Sterling made a silent vow. "He thinks I was a passenger in his life. He's about to find out I was the engine." 8 months later, the bell above the door of the Gilded Page chimed softly. It was a small, dusty, but charming antique bookshop in the West Village. It smelled of old paper, vanilla, and dust mites, a scent Isabella had come to love. "Isabella, can you handle the register? I have to check the shipment in the back." Mrs. Gable, the shop's owner, shouted from the storeroom. Mrs. Gable was 70, partially deaf, and the kindest woman Isabella had ever met. "On it, Margaret," Isabella called back. She wiped her hands on her apron. She wasn't wearing Chanel anymore. She was wearing a soft beige knit sweater from Zara and jeans. Her hair, once blown out daily at a salon on Fifth Avenue, was pulled back in a loose, messy bun. She looked younger. The stress lines around her mouth, etched by years of walking on eggshells around Richard, had softened. She walked to the counter to assist the customer. "Good afternoon. Welcome to the Gilded Page. How can I—" Isabella froze. Standing on the other side of the counter wasn't a regular customer looking for a first edition Dickens. It was a ghost from her past life. "Isabella?" The voice was shocked. It was Caroline Whittaker, the wife of the CEO of J.P. Morgan. They had sat on the board of the Botanical Garden Gala together for 5 years. Caroline was dripping in Fendi, holding a rare architectural digest. Isabella felt a flush of heat rise up her neck. This was the moment she had dreaded. The discovery. "Hello, Caroline," Isabella said, keeping her voice steady, lifting her chin. Caroline's eyes scanned Isabella's outfit, then darted around the small, slightly cluttered shop. Her expression shifted from shock to something resembling horror, then settled into a patronizing pity. "Oh my God. Richard said you were taking some time," Caroline whispered, leaning in as if being poor was contagious. "But I didn't realize you were working retail." "I enjoy it," Isabella said coolly. "I love books. I'm helping manage the inventory." Of course," Caroline said, patting Isabella's hand over the counter. "It's brave. So brave. Look, darling, are you okay? Do you need help?" "I am perfectly fine, Caroline. That book is $150. Would you like it wrapped?" Caroline bought the book, largely out of awkwardness, and practically fled the store. Isabella knew what would happen next. By dinner time, every phone on the Upper East Side would be buzzing. "Did you hear? Isabella Auclair is a shop girl." Poor thing. Richard really left her with nothing. Isabella took a deep breath and leaned against the counter. She closed her eyes. Let them talk. The door chimed again. Isabella straightened up, pasting on a smile. Welcome to the Gilded Page. A man walked in. He was tall, wearing a charcoal grey overcoat that fit him a little too well to be off the rack, but it was worn, the collar slightly frayed. He had dark hair touched with silver at the temples, and eyes the colour of slate, grey and unreadable. He carried himself with a quiet, heavy stillness. He didn't look like the frantic, status-obsessed men Isabella used to know. He looked like a man who worked with his hands, perhaps a high-end contractor or a specialist mechanic. I'm looking for a specific book, he said. His voice was deep, gravelly. A 1920s repair manual for a distinct engine type. The Rolls-Royce Phantom Oi. It's a long shot. Isabella's mind clicked. She knew exactly where it was. She had catalogued it last week, wondering who on earth would want a greasy, century-old mechanic's guide. Third shelf on the left, bottom row, Isabella said immediately. Blue spine. The spirit of maintenance. It's in surprisingly good condition. The man looked at her, surprised, one eyebrow raised. You know your inventory. I know every book in this shop, she replied. He walked to the shelf, retrieved the book and flipped through it. A small, genuine smile touched his lips. It changed his face completely, making him look younger, less guarded. He brought it to the counter. You have no idea how long I've been looking for this, he said. I'm restoring an old beauty. She's been sitting in a garage in Jersey for 40 years. This is the missing piece. It sounds like a labor of love, Isabella said, ringing him up. $45. He handed her a $50 bill. His hands were rough, calloused, but his nails were clean. Keep the change. We don't do tips, sir, Isabella said, handing him a $5 bill. But thank you. He paused, looking at her properly for the first time. He seemed to study her face, not with the predatory gaze of the men at the country club, but with a curiosity that made Isabella's heart skip a beat. I'm Silas, he said. Isabella. Well, Isabella, thank you. You just saved a very expensive piece of machinery from becoming scrap metal. He turned to leave, but stopped at the door. You know, for a bookstore clerk, you have the posture of a duchess. Isabella laughed, a short, dry sound. Former duchess. Current clerk. Silas didn't ask. He just nodded, tipped his head, and walked out into the crisp autumn air. Isabella watched him go. It was the first pleasant interaction she'd had with a man in 8 months. Two weeks later, the invitation arrived. It wasn't mailed to her apartment in Brooklyn. It was hand-delivered to the bookstore, addressed to Miss Isabella Sterling. It was a heavy, cream envelope with gold embossing. The Sterling Eau Claire Foundation Annual Charity Gala. Requesting the pleasure of your company. Isabella stared at it. The foundation. She had started it. She had built it from the ground up, organizing auctions, vetting charities, raising millions for children's literacy. When they divorced, Richard's lawyers had argued that the foundation was an asset of Eau Claire Holdings. She had been forced to resign from the board. Why was he inviting her? Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Thought you might want to see what we've done with the place, unless you're too busy shelving paperbacks. Richard. It was a taunt. He wanted her to come so he could parade Camille around as the new chairwoman of the foundation. He wanted to show the world that Isabella was fully replaced, that she would show up in a cheap dress, looking tired and defeated, to kiss the ring. Bad news? Mrs. Gable asked, seeing Isabella's pale face. A summons, Isabella muttered. She moved to throw the invitation in the trash. Don't, Mrs. Gable said sharply. Isabella froze. Margaret, You built that foundation, didn't you? I remember reading about it years ago. You're that Isabella." I was. "If you don't go," Mrs. Gable said, polishing a brass lamp, "you're telling him he was right. You're telling him you don't exist anymore." "I can't go, Margaret. I don't have a dress. I don't have jewelry. I don't have a way to get there. I take the subway now. You can't arrive at the Met Gala in a subway car." The bell chimed. It was Silas. He was wearing a mechanic's jumpsuit this time, bearing the logo Mercer Restorations. He looked tired, grease on his cheek. "Back again?" Isabella asked, trying to hide the invitation behind her back. "I need a book on upholstery, leather stitching," Silas said. He looked at her, sensing the tension. "Everything okay?" Isabella looked at this stranger. She didn't know why, but the frustration bubbled over. "My ex-husband," she blurted out. "He's throwing a gala for the charity I started, and he invited me just to humiliate me. And the worst part is, I want to go. I want to walk in there and show him I'm still standing. But I can't." Silas leaned against the counter. The air around him felt solid, reliable. "Why can't you?" "Because in that world, Silas, appearance is everything. I need a gown, diamonds, and a car that doesn't smell like wet dog. I have none of those things." Silas looked at her thoughtfully. He glanced at the grease on his hands, then back at her eyes. "I can't help you with the dress," Silas said slowly. "But I know cars. Mercer Restorations. We handle high-end fleets, vintage Rolls, Bentleys. Sometimes we chauffeur them for events to ensure the engines are handled correctly." Isabella blinked. You drive them?" "I can," Silas said. He shrugged. "I have a 1935 Rolls-Royce Phantom getting finished this week. Jet black. Suicide doors. It's fit for royalty. It needs a test run." He leaned in closer. "You get the dress, Isabella. I'll make sure you arrive in a way that makes every head turn. I'll be your chauffeur." Isabella stared at him. It was crazy. He was a customer, a mechanic, but there was a glint in his eye. A challenge. "Why would you do that?" she whispered. Silas smiled, a crooked, dangerous smile. "Because I've dealt with men like your ex-husband my whole life, and I love seeing them lose." The rain had turned the Brooklyn skyline into a smear of charcoal and grey, matching the turbulence inside Isabella's small walk-up apartment. The invitation lay on her kitchen counter like a radioactive isotope, glowing with malice. It was 6 p.m. on the night of the gala. Isabella stood before her closet. It was a pathetic sight compared to the walk-in dressing room she had left behind on Park Avenue. There were no rows of seasonal Prada, no color-coordinated sections of cashmere, just a rack of sensible work clothes and a few plastic bins shoved into the corner. Richard had been meticulous during the asset division. He had kept the jewelry, family heirlooms, he claimed, though he had bought them for her. He had kept the furs. He had even argued over the designer gowns, claiming they were purchased with company funds for public relations events. She had left with 2 suitcases of basics. "He wants me to fail," she whispered to the empty room. "He wants me to show up in a department store cocktail dress so he can introduce me to his investors as his unfortunate past." She knelt down and pulled out a dusty plastic bin from the back of the closet. It was marked University, Paris, 1998. Isabella hadn't opened this box in 20 years. Richard had hated her discussing her time studying art history in Paris. He found it bohemian and unrefined. He preferred the narrative that she had merely existed waiting for him to rescue her. She popped the lid. The smell of lavender sachets, old and dry, wafted up. Beneath a stack of sketchbooks and old metro tickets, wrapped in acid-free tissue paper, was a garment she hadn't thought of in decades. It wasn't a designer label that Camille would recognize. It was a vintage piece Isabella had found in a dusty shop in Le Marais when she was 22, bought with money she had saved from waitressing. She pulled it out. It was a 1930s bias-cut silk gown in a shade of red so deep it looked like arterial blood in the dim light. It was backless, held together by impossibly thin spaghetti straps, plunging dangerously low in the front. It was liquid elegance. Richard had forbidden her from wearing it. "It's too aggressive, Isabella," he had told her once when she tried it on for a dinner party. "It makes you look hungry. An eau claire wife is demure. An eau claire wife is pastel." Isabella stripped off her jeans and sweater. She stepped into the silk. It was cold against her skin, heavy and fluid. She pulled the straps up. The zipper hissed as she pulled it shut. It still fit. If anything, the stress of the last year had made her leaner, and the dress draped over her collarbones and hips like it was poured on. She walked to the cheap, full-length mirror leaning against the wall. She didn't look like a wife. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a siren rising from the ocean to drag a sailor to his death. She had no diamonds. Richard had them all. So she made a choice. No jewelry, not a single stud. She swept her hair up into a severe, high knot, exposing the long, elegant line of her neck and the sharp cut of her jaw. She painted her lips a matte crimson that matched the silk perfectly. She was the weapon. The dress was just the casing. Her phone buzzed. "I'm downstairs. Don't come out. I'm coming up to escort you." "Silas." Isabella grabbed her small black clutch, the only designer item she had managed to smuggle out, and opened her apartment door. Silas was standing in the hallway. The transformation was jarring. The grease-stained mechanic was gone. In his place stood a man in a tuxedo that fit him with military precision. It was midnight blue, contrasting sharply with his slate-grey eyes. He was freshly shaved, smelling of sandalwood and clean linen. He looked dangerous, not in a thug-like way, but in the way a dormant volcano is dangerous. He looked up as she stepped into the hallway, and for a moment the air left the corridor. Silas didn't say, "You look nice." He didn't say, "Wow." He went completely still. His eyes travelled from the hem of the crimson silk up to her exposed shoulders, finally locking onto her eyes. He swallowed, a slow, deliberate movement of his throat. "I was wrong," Silas said, his voice rougher than usual. "About what?" Isabella asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I said I would drive you to make them look, but looking at you now, I don't think they're going to survive it." He offered her his arm. "Shall we, Mrs. Sterling?" "Miss Sterling," she corrected, taking his arm. It was rock solid. "Ms. Sterling," he amended. "Let's go start a war." Downstairs, the streetlights of Brooklyn reflected off the wet pavement. And there, double parked and taking up the space of 2 Honda Civics, sat the beast. It was the Rolls-Royce Phantom Foy. But not just any Phantom. It was the Jonquière coupe body style, a round-door masterpiece from the 1930s. It was jet black, massive and intimidating, with curves that looked like Art Deco architecture on wheels. It didn't look like a car. It looked like a darkly enchanting locomotive. The chrome grille gleamed like the teeth of a predator. Silas opened the rear suicide door, hinged at the back, opening outward to expose the entire cabin. The interior was cream leather and polished walnut. "This car," Silas said quietly as she slid into the back, "was built for a Rajah who lost his throne, but kept his dignity." I thought it fitting. He closed the door with a solid, heavy thud that shut out the noise of the city completely. Isabella sat in the silence, the leather smelling of history and money. As Silas slid into the driver's seat and fired the ignition, the engine didn't roar. It purred, a low subsonic vibration that she felt in her spine. "To the Met," Silas said, catching her eye in the rearview mirror. "Take your time, Isabella. Breathe. By the time we get there, you won't be the ex-wife. You'll be the only thing they see." The approach to the Metropolitan Museum of Art was a gridlock of wealth. A line of black Cadillac Escalades and stretch Lincolns snaked around the block, idling as they waited to deposit the city's elite onto the red carpet draped over the iconic steps. Flashbulbs popped incessantly, a strobe light effect that illuminated the misty rain. Inside the warmth of the Rolls-Royce, the world felt slow. Isabella watched through the tinted glass as people she had known for 15 years stepped out of their cars. There was the banking commissioner. There was the editor of Vogue. They all looked the same, polished, safe, uniform. "We're 3 cars out," Silas said over the intercom. His voice was calm, anchoring her. "I'm terrified," Isabella admitted to the empty cabin. "Look at them," Silas commanded gently. "Look at Richard. Do you see him?" Isabella squinted. Near the top of the stairs, standing under the massive awning, was Richard. He was holding court. He wore a velvet tuxedo jacket, too trendy for his age, and Camille was draped on his arm. Camille was wearing white feathers and diamonds, looking like a debutante at her first ball. Richard was checking his watch, his face etched with impatience. He was waiting for Isabella to fail. He was waiting for her to not show up or to arrive in a yellow taxi. "I see him," Isabella said, her voice hardening. "He looks small from here, doesn't he?" Silas remarked. The car in front of them, a gaudy gold-wrapped Lamborghini, finally moved off. "Showtime," Silas murmured. He didn't pull up quickly. He let the Rolls-Royce creep forward, the massive black fenders parting the air. The sheer size of the car, its vintage silhouette, was so alien in the sea of modern SUVs that the crowd fell silent before the car even stopped. The engine cut. Silence. The paparazzi lowered their cameras for a split second, confused. This wasn't a celebrity rental. This was museum-quality money. This was old money that didn't scream, it whispered. Silas didn't open the door immediately. He waited. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. The tension outside grew. Richard had stopped talking. He was staring down the steps, frowning, trying to figure out who had arrived in a vehicle worth more than his entire portfolio. Camille was craning her neck. Then the driver's door opened. Silas stepped out. He buttoned his tuxedo jacket with one fluid motion. He walked around the back of the massive car, his posture impeccable, his face a mask of professional indifference. He ignored the press. He ignored the valet who tried to approach. He reached the rear passenger door, the suicide door. He placed his hand on the handle. He paused, looking up at Richard at the top of the stairs. Silas locked eyes with the ex-husband, holding the gaze for a heartbeat, a challenge thrown across 50 feet of red carpet. "Watch closely." Silas pulled the handle. The heavy door swung backward, revealing the cavernous, illuminated interior. First, the leg emerged. The pale skin, the sharp arch of the foot, the simple black stiletto heel hitting the red carpet with a deliberate click. Then, Isabella rose. As she stepped out of the darkness of the car into the flashing lights, the crimson silk dress caught the glare of the paparazzi bulbs. It rippled like liquid fire. The backless cut exposed her spine, straight and proud. She stood there for a moment, adjusting to the light. The wind caught a loose tendril of her hair. The silence was absolute. Camille's smile faltered. The feathers on her dress suddenly looked ridiculous, like a costume. Richard's glass of champagne tilted dangerously in his hand. Isabella didn't look at the cameras. She turned to Silas. Silas bowed his head slightly. Not a servant's bow, but a partner's acknowledgement. "I'll have the engine running, Ms. Sterling." "Thank you, Silas," she said, her voice carrying in the quiet. She turned to the stairs. A murmur broke out among the press. "Who is that? Is that the Eau Claire wife? My God, look at the dress. Is that vintage V on it? Where did she get the car?" The flashbulbs erupted, a blinding wall of white light, 10 times more intense than what Richard had received. They weren't photographing a discarded wife. They were photographing a mystery. A woman who had been thrown to the wolves and came back, leading the pack. Isabella began to climb the stairs. She walked slowly. She didn't rush to Richard. She forced him to wait. She forced him to watch her ascend, step by step, while the entire city of New York watched with him. When she finally reached the top landing, she stopped 2 feet in front of him. Richard looked like he had been struck in the chest. His eyes darted over her, the dress, the lack of jewelry, the glowing skin, the terrifying confidence. He looked for the cracks. He looked for the poverty he had inflicted on her. He found nothing but gold. "Isabella," he choked out. It was less a greeting and more a question of reality. Isabella offered a cool, thin smile. She glanced at Camille, then back to Richard. "Richard," she nodded. "Lovely setup. The floral arrangements are a bit chaotic. But I suppose that's the new aesthetic." She didn't wait for a response. She stepped around him, moving toward the grand doors of the museum. Richard grabbed her arm, a violation of the unspoken social contract. "Who's the car belong to? Isabella. Who are you sleeping with?" he hissed, his face flushing red. Isabella looked down at his hand on her arm until he released it, embarrassed. "That's the difference between us, Richard," she said, her voice low enough that only he and Camille could hear. "You think power comes from who you own or who you sleep with." She leaned in, her perfume, something spicy and unfamiliar, filling his senses. "I didn't sleep with anyone to get here. I just finally remembered who I was before I met you." She turned and walked into the great hall, the crimson train of her dress following her like a pool of blood, leaving Richard standing in the rain, looking very expensive and very, very small. Inside, the gala had already begun, but as Isabella entered, the room shifted. Conversations died. Heads turned. Arthur Blackwood, the shark lawyer, dropped his canapé. Isabella took a glass of champagne from a passing tray. She stood alone in the center of the room, under the temple of Denda. She had no husband. She had no fortune. But as the whispers began to circulate, Isabella took a sip and tasted something she hadn't tasted in 15 years. Victory. But she didn't know that outside, inside the idling Rolls-Royce, Silas was on the phone. "Yes," Silas said into his cell, watching the museum doors. "She's inside. The target is Richard Eau Claire. Execute Phase 2 of the acquisition. I want his stock plummeting by the time dessert is served." He hung up, his grey eyes narrowing. He wasn't just a mechanic, and he wasn't just a chauffeur. Richard Eau Claire had made a lot of enemies on his way to the top, but he had never made an enemy of the Sterling family, and he had certainly never met Silas Sterling, Isabella's estranged cousin, the venture capitalist who had been exiled to London 20 years ago and had just returned to settle the family scores. Isabella didn't know it yet, but she wasn't just walking into a party. She was walking into a takeover. The Temple of Denda inside the Metropolitan Museum was bathed in soft amber light, casting long, ancient shadows against the sandstone walls. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, stale champagne, and heavy judgment. Isabella moved through the crowd like a ghost haunting her own life. She recognized every face. There was Eleanor Vance, who had attended Isabella's baby shower for the child she had miscarried. There was Julian Thorpe, the banker who had handled the Eau Claire accounts. As Isabella passed, conversations didn't just stop, they fractured. Eyes darted to her backless crimson dress, then to her face, searching for signs of the mental breakdown Richard had promised them she was suffering. "Isabella?" Eleanor Vance's voice was high and brittle. She stepped in front of Isabella, blocking her path near the hors d'oeuvres. We didn't expect to see you. Richard said you were in recovery." Isabella paused, her grip on her clutch tightening just enough to turn her knuckles white. "Recovery implies sickness, Eleanor. I'm simply in transition." "Right, of course," Eleanor stammered, her eyes scanning Isabella's lack of jewelry. "It's just seeing you here. It's brave, very brave, especially with Camille running the auction tonight." "Courage has nothing to do with it," Isabella replied smoothly, her voice low and melodic. "I built this foundation. I don't need permission to visit my own creation." She stepped around Eleanor, leaving the woman flustered. But the relief was short-lived. Across the room, Richard had spotted her again. He had downed 2 more scotches since the red carpet. The humiliation of her arrival was gnawing at him, dismantling his carefully curated image of the benevolent, suffering ex-husband. He whispered something to the head of security, a burly man named Gorman, and pointed directly at Isabella. Gorman began to move through the crowd toward her. Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs. "He's going to have me escorted out. He's going to drag me out in front of everyone." She looked around for an exit, her breath catching in her throat. She was alone. The adrenaline of the entrance was fading, replaced by the cold reality that she was a bookstore clerk crashing a billionaire's party. "Miss Sterling," Gorman said, stepping into her personal space. He was polite but firm. "Mr. Auclair has requested that you relocate. There is a concern that your presence is causing a disturbance." "I have an invitation," Isabella said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's a private event, ma'am. The host retains the right to refuse entry. Please don't make a scene." Richard was watching from the bar, a smug, satisfied smirk plastered on his face. He raised his glass to her. Checkmate. Isabella felt the tears stinging the back of her eyes. This was it. The final humiliation. "Take your hand off her." The voice didn't come from the crowd. It came from the main entrance of the hall. It was a voice that carried the weight of a gavel striking a desk. Gorman turned. Richard froze. Silas was walking into the room. He wasn't wearing a chauffeur's cap. He was walking with the casual arrogance of a man who owned the floorboards beneath his feet. He walked straight through the parting crowd, ignoring the gasps. "Who are you?" Gorman asked, stepping between Isabella and Silas. "Staff are not permitted in the main hall." Richard stormed over, his face purple. "This is her driver. Good God, Isabella, have you no shame? Bringing the help inside?" He turned to Gorman. "Throw them both out, now." Silas didn't look at Gorman. He looked at Richard. He stepped closer, towering over the ex-husband by 3 inches. The air around them seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I'm not the help, Richard," Silas said quietly. He reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a sleek, black envelope. He held it up. "I'm the donor." Richard blinked. "What?" "The platinum table," Silas said, his voice bored. "Table 1, the anonymous donation of $500,000 that funded tonight's dinner? That was me." The room went dead silent. A $500,000 donation. That bought you God status in this room. "You're a mechanic," Richard sputtered, his brain failing to process the information. "I saw your hands. You were driving the car." "I like cars," Silas shrugged. "And I like driving. It clears my head before I make acquisitions." Silas turned to Isabella, his eyes softening instantly. He offered her his arm, ignoring the stunned security guard and the paralyzed ex-husband. "I believe our table is ready, Ms. Sterling. Right at the front." Isabella looked at him, her mind reeling. "Who are you?" she screamed internally, but outwardly she simply took his arm. It was an anchor in the storm. "Yes," she whispered. "Let's sit." As they walked past Richard, Silas paused. He leaned in, his voice a razor blade wrapped in velvet. "By the way, Richard, you should check your phone. I think you're trending." Dinner was a blur of terrified waiters and aggressive whispering. Isabella and Silas sat at table 1, center stage. It was the table usually reserved for Richard and his board of directors. But the placard simply read, "The Sterling Trust." Richard and Camille had been relegated to table 2, off to the side. Camille was furious, aggressively stabbing at her salad. Richard was sweating profusely, checking his phone under the table every 30 seconds. "Eat," Silas said gently, nudging a plate of sea bass toward Isabella. "You'll need the energy." "Silas," Isabella hissed, leaning in. "What is going on? You fix engines. You bought a $40 book on repair manuals. How did you donate $500,000? Silas picked up his wine glass. He looked at the deep red liquid, swirling it. "I told you I was away for a long time," he said softly. "I didn't say I was idle. My father, your uncle, left me nothing but debt. I went to London and built something from the ashes, a venture capital firm, Chimera Global." Isabella gasped. Everyone knew Chimera. It was a predatory firm known for hostile takeovers of failing luxury brands. They were ruthless. They were the Vikings of the corporate world. You are Chimera?" "I am the majority partner," Silas corrected. "And for the last 6 months, while you were learning the inventory of that bookstore, I was analyzing the inventory of Eau Claire Holdings." Isabella stared at him. "Why? Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you needed to find your own strength first," Silas said, looking deep into her eyes. "If I had saved you on day 1, you would still be his victim. Tonight, you stood up to him. You're not a victim anymore, Isabella. You're a partner." A spoon clinked against a glass. Richard was at the podium. He looked pale. His tie was slightly crooked. He gripped the microphone stand as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard's voice boomed, though it wavered slightly. "Thank you for coming. Tonight is about legacy. It's about building a future." He tried to smile, but his eyes were darting around the room. Eau Claire Holdings has always been a pillar of stability. We value family." A distinct ding sound echoed through the room. It was a notification sound, then another, then a vibration on the table next to them. Suddenly, a wave of noise rippled through the hall. It wasn't applause. It was the sound of 300 wealthy investors checking their Bloomberg apps simultaneously. Richard faltered. "As I was saying, oh my God," a woman at table 4 whispered loudly. "It's crashing. Dump it now!" A man at table 6 shouted into his phone, abandoning all decorum. Richard stopped speaking. "Excuse me?" Isabella watched, confused. She looked at Silas. Silas was calmly buttering a bread roll. "What is happening?" she whispered. "The news just broke," Silas said casually. "A report was just released regarding Eau Claire Holdings. It details the falsified sustainability reports in the supply chain, the hidden debt in the offshore accounts, and the impending class action lawsuit from the shareholders." "Who released the report?" Isabella asked, horrified. Silas took a bite of bread. "I did." On stage, Richard's phone rang, loudly. He pulled it out, saw the screen, and his face went grey. It was the board. I have to," Richard stammered into the microphone. "There seems to be a technical difficulty." "It's not technical, Richard." A man stood up near the back. It was Arthur Blackwood, his own lawyer. "The stock is down 40% in 10 minutes. We're bleeding out." Chaos erupted. Waiters were shoved aside as bankers rushed for the exits to make emergency calls. The gala was dissolving into a trading floor panic. Silas wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. He stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He didn't use a microphone. He didn't need to. He projected his voice with the authority of an executioner. "Richard!" Silas shouted. The room froze. Richard looked down from the stage, his eyes wild with panic. "You're looking for a lifeline," Silas called out, walking slowly toward the stage. "But no bank in this city will touch you now. Your assets are frozen. Your liquidity is gone. You are effectively insolvent." Silas stopped at the base of the stairs. "However," Silas continued, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a folded document, "there is one offer on the table, a buyout." Richard stared at him. Who are you?" Silas climbed the first step. "I represent the Sterling Trust. We are prepared to purchase the controlling interest of Eau Claire Holdings at the current market price." He paused, checking his watch. "Which is roughly $3 a share." Isabella stood up. The realization hit her like a lightning bolt. The Sterling Trust. Silas wasn't just destroying Richard, he was buying the company back, and he was putting it in her name. "You can't do this!" Richard screamed, sweat pouring down his face. "This is my company. I built this." "No," Silas said coldly, climbing the final step to stand next to the terrified man. "You married into the capital that built this, and then you discarded the woman who gave it to you." Silas turned to the crowd. He gestured to Isabella, who was standing alone in the center of the room, a beacon of red in a sea of black suits. "I am acquiring this company," Silas announced to the room. "But I will not be running it. I'm just the capital. The CEO position will be returned to the person who actually understands the soul of this foundation." He looked at Richard. "Sign the papers, Richard, or go to prison for fraud. Those are your options." Richard looked at Camille. Camille was already gone. She had slipped out the side door the moment the stock dropped. Defeated, broken, and utterly alone, Richard took the pen Silas offered. Isabella watched as her ex-husband signed away his empire on the podium of his own vanity. She felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned. It was Mrs. Gable from the bookstore, who had somehow slipped in past security, wearing her Sunday best. "I told you," Mrs. Gable whispered, her eyes twinkling. "You were never just a clerk, dear." Silas walked down the stairs, the signed contract in his hand. He walked straight to Isabella. The room watched, breathless, terrified, awestruck. He held the contract out to her. "The car is waiting, Miss Sterling," Silas said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "And tomorrow morning you have a board meeting. I suggest we get you home so you can rest." Isabella took the paper. It was heavy. It weighed as much as 15 years of pain. And just like that, the weight was gone. The morning sun over Manhattan was sharp and unforgiving. It didn't offer the soft haze of the previous night's gala. It exposed everything. At 8:45 a.m., Richard Auclair stood in the lobby of the building that still bore his name in chrome letters above the revolving doors. He was wearing the same tuxedo from the night before, now rumpled and smelling of stale scotch. He hadn't gone home to the penthouse because his biometric keycard hadn't worked. He hadn't gone to a hotel because his credit cards had been declined at the Four Seasons at 3:00 a.m. He walked toward the elevator bank, his head down, hoping to slip up to his office and salvage whatever liquid assets he had hidden in the safe. "Sir, hold it right there." Richard froze. It was Gorman, the head of security. The same man Richard had ordered to throw Isabella out just 12 hours ago. "Gorman," Richard said, trying to summon his old authority. "I need to get to the 55th floor. My keycard is malfunctioning." Gorman stood with his arms crossed, flanked by 2 other guards. He didn't look intimidated. He looked tired. "Your pass isn't malfunctioning, Mr. Auclair. It's been deactivated, per the directive of the new majority shareholder." "I am the founder of this company," Richard shouted, his voice cracking. The lobby, filled with employees rushing to work, went quiet. People stared, they whispered, they held up their phones to record. The great Richard Auclair, screaming in a tuxedo in the morning light. "You were the founder," a voice said from behind him. "Now you're a liability." Richard spun around. The revolving doors slowed to a halt. Walking in wasn't Silas, it was Isabella. She wore a sharp, tailored white suit, the color of a fresh page. Her hair was down, loose and wavy. She didn't look like the woman who had signed divorce papers in tears in this very building. She looked like the building belonged to her. Because it did. Silas walked a step behind her, wearing his mechanic's jumpsuit again, carrying a helmet. He had no interest in boardrooms. He had done his job. Isabella stopped in front of Richard. She didn't look angry. She didn't look vindictive. She looked at him with the mild curiosity one might have for a stranger. "Isabella," Richard gasped, stepping toward her. "Bella, please, you have to stop this. They locked me out of the accounts. Camille took the jewelry and left this morning. I have nothing. I have nowhere to go." He reached for her hand. "We were married for 15 years. Doesn't that mean anything?" Isabella looked at his hand. The hand that had dismissed her. The hand that had signed away her security without a second thought. "It means I know exactly who you are, Richard," she said softly. "You're a man who only loves reflections of himself. And right now, you don't have a mirror left." She signaled to Gorman. "Mr. Gorman, please escort Mr. Auclair off the premises. He is disrupting business." "Isabella!" Richard screamed as Gorman grabbed his arm. "You can't do this. You're a shop girl. You're nothing without me." Isabella didn't flinch. She leaned in close, so only he could hear the final nail in the coffin. "You're right, Richard. I was a shop girl. And we're hiring in the mail room. If you fill out an application, I'll put in a good word. But you'll have to start at the bottom. Like I did." She straightened up and walked past him toward the elevators. The staff parted like the Red Sea. They weren't looking at Richard anymore. They were looking at their new CEO. Silas remained in the lobby for a moment, watching Richard being dragged out the doors onto the unforgiving pavement of Fifth Avenue. He walked over to the reception desk, where a young, terrified receptionist was watching. Silas placed a single business card on the desk. "If he comes back," Silas said, his grey eyes cold, "call me. I'll bring the car around." He turned and walked out to his Rolls-Royce waiting at the curb. He wasn't staying for the board meeting. His work was done. He had restored the engine. Now, it was up to Isabella to drive. Up on the 55th floor, Isabella walked into the office that used to be Richard's. It smelled of his expensive cologne. She walked to the window and threw it open. The wind rushed in, chaotic and fresh, blowing the papers off the desk. She took a deep breath. She picked up the phone on the mahogany desk. "This is Isabella Sterling," she said to her assistant. "Get me maintenance. I want this office cleared out by noon, and send a check to the Gilded Page bookstore in the West Village. Tell Mrs. Gable her partner is ready to buy the building." She hung up and looked out at the city. Richard had thought the divorce was her end. He hadn't realized that in a story written by a strong woman, a divorce isn't a tragedy. It's a plot twist. And the chauffeur? He didn't just open the door. he helped her close the book on the past forever. Isabella's story isn't just about revenge. It's about the terrifying, beautiful power of reclaiming your own worth. Richard made the fatal mistake of thinking Isabella's value was tied to his name, his money, and his status. He forgot that a diamond doesn't lose its value just because it's in the dark. It just waits for the light to shine again. In the end, the very people he looked down on, the shop girl and the mechanic, were the ones holding the keys to his kingdom. It serves as a brutal reminder. Never mistreat the person holding the umbrella in the rain, because one day they might be the one deciding if you get wet. Does this story remind you of a time you were underestimated? Have you ever had to rebuild yourself from nothing while the world watched? If Isabella's victory gave you chills, hit that like button right now. It helps us share these stories with more people who need to hear them. And if you want to see more stories about instant karma and justice served cold, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Comment karma below if you think Richard got exactly what he deserved. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.